Welcome to the lecture entitled, What is Causation and Can it Explain? I'm Andrew Chapman. In this lecture, we'll cover 7 topics. 1. Aristotle's 4 causes. 2. Causation, Mechanism, and Explanation. 3. Causes are merely necessary and not sufficient for effects. 4. Explanations versus explanation sketches. 5. Ceteris Paribus clauses. 6. Causation as statistical explanation. And 7. Genuine indeterminacy. Even though most people see scientific explanations as in some way unique and generally better within the domain of natural phenomena than non-scientific explanations, it's important to remember that scientific explanations are still explanations. Thus, if there's something that all explanations have in common, then scientific explanations will have this feature as well. We ask for explanations of all sorts via questions. Nearly always, these questions are either why questions, as in, why did that occur the way it did, or how questions, as in, how does this work, how did this get this way? When asking why questions or how questions, then, what are you asking for? What sort of thing are you looking for as a response? And when somebody asks you a why question or a how question, how is it appropriate for you to respond? In what ways have you responded to such questions recently in your life? To get a handle on the general issue of explanation, we can turn back to one of philosophy's founders, Aristotle. Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher and scientist. He was the most famous student of Plato and the tutor of Alexander the Great. His philosophy covered nearly every philosophical subdiscipline, and his taxonomy of the subdisciplines is still with us to this day. For example, metaphysics, that term and that study was created by Aristotle. And much of Aristotle's work, especially in ethics, exerts a substantial influence on contemporary philosophy. According to Aristotle, a thing can be explained in 4 ways, and oftentimes a combination of these ways will give a more complete understanding of the thing. So these aren't 4 competing ways, but 4 complementary ways. Aristotle called these 4 ways 4 asia, a term which is generally translated confusingly as causes, but which might better be translated as reasons or grounds for the thing's existing in just the way it does. I'll continue to use the word causes here as that's the standard terminology, but be careful not to confuse Aristotle's 4 causes with the way we use the term cause today. As you'll see, only one of Aristotle's 4 causes bears a resemblance to the way we use the word cause today. These 4 causes are known as the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause. Even though Aristotle explicated his conception of explanation in terms of the 4 causes 2.5 millennia ago, Each of the types of cause finds its way into our everyday practice of giving and asking for explanations, which shows both how much Aristotle understood the notion of explanation and how much Aristotle's metaphysics has stayed with us to the present day. Something's material cause is the physical stuff, the material out of which it is composed. Something's formal cause is the complete shape, the form that its physical stuff takes. Something's efficient cause is what occurred such that the physical stuff out of which the thing is composed has the form it does, what brought its matter and form together. And something's final cause is its purpose, what it's for. As you'll notice, the efficient cause is the only one here that bears a resemblance to what we call causation today. The other three, remember, even though we're using the term cause because that's how it's generally translated, might better be called reasons or grounds or even explanations for the thing. So take a ship as an example. A ship's material cause is boards and nails, etc. Its formal cause is the form of a ship, curved hull, flat deck, etc. Its efficient cause is the work done by the workers who fashioned the boards and the nails, etc., into a ship. Its final cause is perhaps sailing or getting merchants from point A to point B. Notice that understanding each of the causes of a ship tells you a little bit more about why it exists in the way it does, and thus, learning each of a thing's four causes explains that thing in a specific way. In our contemporary understanding of the world, a world which is structured by a picture of all of the natural phenomena as like mechanisms or like one giant machine, we've generally dropped in a more strict context all but Aristotle's notion of the efficient cause. We leave out the material cause, the formal cause, and the final cause when we're talking about causation and about what explains something's being the way that it is. Mechanism about the natural world is the thesis that the natural world functions like a giant and complex machine. This picture of the way the world is replaced Aristotle's picture of the way the world functions, and this is much of the reason why contemporary philosophers of science and scientists generally think that we only need causation in order to make sense of the sort of thing that something is, in order to explain how it is and why it is the way it is, and we don't need the material cause, the formal cause, or the final cause. Pierre Laplace, a famous Enlightenment mechanist, said this: "We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of the past and the cause of the future. An intellect which at any given moment knew all of the forces that animate nature and the mutual positions of the beings that compose it, if this intellect were vast enough to submit the data to analysis, could condense into a single formula the movement of the greatest bodies of the universe and that of the lightest atom. For such an intellect, nothing could be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes." That is a paradigm statement of mechanism. Think about how a machine functions. You can see, once you understand how the machine functions, what the machine will look like if you rotate its gears just a little bit in one direction or another direction. So if the universe is like a giant machine and functions based on predictable, deterministic laws, and things move only via causation, then if we understood how the entire universe was situated at any particular point in time, then we could tell how it would be situated at some future point in time. If the world functions like a machine, then an understanding of the causal connections between events leaves nothing out. A causal understanding of the world is a complete understanding of the events in the world that are connected by causal connections. This is an intuitive picture of explanation and of the role that causation plays in explanation and why causation plays that explanatory role. And most of us, most of the time when we give explanations, whether those are scientific explanations or just non-scientific everyday explanations, cite causes. So we understand this picture at an intuitive level. Now, while this standard causal explanatory picture seems to make sense within this specific framework of mechanism, and if we can properly articulate the notion of causation and its relation to explanation, there have been a number of serious challenges to this overall picture. These challenges have come in many forms, from questioning how causation itself is supposed to function in the standard explanatory way within the framework of mechanism, to denying that causation is used by scientists in the traditional necessitarian way, that is, that cause and effect are connected by necessity, to challenging the entire framework of mechanism and the place that causation is supposed to sit within this framework. In this lecture, we'll look at a number of these sorts of problems for the causal explanatory picture and see what can be done about them, see where this leaves us. One way to understand causation at a deeper philosophical level is to recognize that the connection between cause and effect is lawful, meaning it happens without exception and by necessity. The distinction between causation and a mere coincidence is relevantly similar to the distinction between a law and an accidental regularity. While both laws and accidental regularities hold without exception, laws hold without exception because they couldn't possibly have done otherwise. They're necessary. Accidental regularities hold merely coincidentally. There's no necessary force that makes them happen the way they do. To determine whether a connection is lawful or merely an accidental regularity, and notice the implications this will have for causation. See whether the connection supports a relevant counterfactual conditional. A counterfactual conditional is an if-then statement where the if side is false. For example, if there were a dog in my kitchen, then there would be a mammal in my kitchen. This is a counterfactual conditional. There is no dog in my kitchen, unfortunately, right now. And it is supported by the law that all dogs are mammals. So it's not a mere accident that all dogs have been mammals. All dogs must be mammals. And this is what our counterfactual conditional shows. I know that if there were a dog in my kitchen, then it would have to be a mammal because there's a law that tells me that all dogs are mammals. Now, it is a fact that all dogs have been less than 1,000 pounds, but not because there's some law such that it was impossible for there to ever be a dog that weighed over 1,000 pounds. So if we had the counterfactual conditional, if there's a dog in my kitchen, then it weighs less than 1,000 pounds. Well, nothing supports that underneath it. Nothing makes that true. We would actually have to go and see if there were a dog in my kitchen. If there weren't, then we would have no idea whether it would be the case that if there were a dog in my kitchen, it would be less than 1,000 pounds. Only laws can support counterfactual conditionals. While we generally think of causes as sufficient for, that is, enough to bring about their effects, and people even sometimes call causes sufficient causes, it's not clear that this picture of causation is correct. So imagine that I knock my keys off the table with my hand and they fall to the ground. We would generally say that my hitting the keys caused the keys to fall, and we would take that as an acceptable explanation. Nothing seems strange here. And what we're saying so far is in line with a traditional causal explanatory picture of a mechanistic framework of the world. But my keys wouldn't have fallen had gravity not existed, or if the table had been wider than it was, or had there been a force stronger than gravity that had pulled them upward, etc., etc. And this is an infinitely long list of further necessary conditions that have to be satisfied for my keys to fall. So it's not as though my hand hitting the keys was sufficient for the keys to fall. A lot more was needed. But is that infinitely long list of additional necessary conditions part of the cause itself? If it is, then we can never identify a cause, since a description of a cause would be infinitely long, and we can't identify something that's infinitely long. But if that infinitely long list is not part of the cause, then a cause is not a sufficient thing enough to bring about the effect. It is merely a necessary member of a set of things that together were sufficient to bring about an effect. Already we're seeing that the standard picture of the role that causation plays in the mechanistic understanding of the world is not quite right. And if that picture isn't quite right, then we should start to wonder, is it possible for causation to do the explanatory work that we thought it was? If causation is not a sufficient condition for an effect, but is merely a necessary condition that is a member of an infinite set of conditions, and that set itself is what's sufficient for bringing about some effect, then we might think that we've lost causation somewhere during our analysis, or that we've lost the explanatory part of causation somewhere during our analysis. Conditions are things that are in place so that something else can happen, but causation doesn't seem to be merely a necessary condition for the effect. The glue that we used to have here between events, the causation that held events together, seems to have disappeared from our analysis, and with it, perhaps, explanation. We cared about causation in terms of the current discussion of explanation because, one, causation has been tied to explanation for as long as there have been analyses of the nature of explanation. Two, many contemporary accounts of scientific explanation make use of the notion of causation. And three, the contemporary mechanistic picture of reality holds that causation is what drives the machine of the universe. So our caring about causation was for all of these reasons, but once we started to look at causation and how it was related to explanation, that relationship started to break down between causation and explanation. Most of the time, in a scientific or in a non-scientific context, when someone asks us for an explanation of something that happened or for an explanation of our behavior, the explanation we give in response is not actually a complete explanation, but is instead an explanation sketch, something that could be filled in, we think, if need be, but that usually doesn't need to be filled in because interlocutors bring substantial background knowledge and expectations to the conversation. However, are such explanation sketches appropriate in science? We generally think of science as not operating on unarticulated assumptions, as making all of its content clear to anyone who cares to examine it. But as we've seen, at least in terms of causal explanation, it doesn't seem as though it's even possible to make all of the content clear, since there's an infinite amount of content in any complete description of the sufficient conditions for something's coming about. Just citing something's cause only tells you what was necessary or required for the thing to come about, but it doesn't tell you what made the thing come about. But that was one of the reasons why we cared about explanation to begin with. So, if most of what we give in terms of explanations are explanation sketches, and it's impossible to fill in the remaining content of the explanation sketch, are we still doing science? Is this acceptable? One reason we traditionally thought that causes were able to explain events is that understanding a cause will lead one to expect the event that is its effect. This expectation picture of explanation was present in early models of explanation that didn't even make use of the notion of causation. For example, the deductive nomological model. And the picture interacts nicely with an understanding of explanation and prediction as two sides of the same coin. If we explain by showing why something should be expected, then if we know all of those factors that would be relevant to explanation, we can predict how the future would be. Also notice how this is related to the overall picture of mechanism. However, if a cause is just one necessary condition that is a member of an infinitely large set of conditions, and the set itself is what's sufficient for some event, then knowing a cause will no longer give any reason to expect the effect. What we would need to know is the cause along with all of the other conditions that would be necessary for the cause to come about. One way to both retain causation as explanatory and to continue to conceive of explanation in terms of bringing about expectation is to employ what's known as a Ceteris Paribus clause when describing causal relationships. A Ceteris Paribus clause is an everything else staying the same or everything else being equal clause. Thus, in employing a Ceteris Paribus clause, we don't actually have to account for an infinite number of other factors that needed to be in place for our effect to come about. The Ceteris Paribus clause does that for us. So, what I might say is, I can tell you why the keys fell on the ground. My hand hitting them was a cause, and then the keys fell onto the ground, Ceteris Paribus, keeping everything else equal. Or I can say that the explanation of the keys falling onto the ground was Ceteris Paribus, that my hand hit the keys and caused them to fall. So the Ceteris Paribus clause, because the members of the Ceteris Paribus clause are not themselves the cause, that just keeps all of the other stuff the same so that I can talk about the thing that changed, the thing that we think is doing the explaining. Now, there is a worry for employing Ceteris Paribus clauses. Says Alex Rosenberg, if most of the laws we actually invoke in explanation carry implicit or explicit Ceteris Paribus clauses, then testing these laws requires establishing that other things are indeed equal. But doing so for an inexhaustible list of conditions and qualifications is obviously impossible. And this means that there are no detectable differences in kind between real laws with inexhaustible Ceteris Paribus clauses and pseudo-laws without real law-based force. Disguised definitions, astrological principles, New Age occult theories of pyramid power or crystal magic. For these latter, quote, laws, too, can be protected from apparent disconfirmation by the presence of Ceteris Paribus clauses. All Virgos are happy, Ceteris Paribus, cannot be disconfirmed by an unhappy person with a mid-August birthday, since we cannot establish that besides the person's unhappiness, all other things are equal. So, it might be the case that my hitting the keys with my hand explains why they fell to the floor. Or it might be the case that the relative positions of Mars and Mercury and Venus and the Moon is what explains why my keys fell to the floor. We can't know if we invoke a Ceteris Paribus clause because Ceteris Paribus clauses are not testable because there are an infinite number of members in the clauses. So this doesn't mean that we can't use Ceteris Paribus clauses. What it means is that we need to decide which are the acceptable ones and which are not the acceptable ones, but that's going to require something over and above merely causation, merely scientific observable facts. We'll need some philosophically robust theory here about which are the acceptable and which are the unacceptable Ceteris Paribus clauses. And recall that this is all so that we can claim that causation is explanatory. The only way to claim causation is explanatory is to make sense of an infinite list of facts over and above the cause that together were sufficient for the effect. If we want to use causes as explanations for things, we need to be able to make sense of an infinite set of other necessary factors for something to happen, and that opens the door to pseudoscience. Now, the picture of causation that we've been working here is somewhat simplified. Most causal explanations in contemporary science are not given simply in terms of a y caused x formulation where every time y occurred, z occurred, Ceteris Paribus, keeping everything else equal. Instead, scientists generally say that a causal relationship exists between two phenomena, even though that relationship is merely statistical. This is just in fact the way that scientists use causation a lot of the time. So, for example, it is true that smoking causes lung cancer, even though not everyone who smokes gets lung cancer. So the fact that there are some people who smoke that don't get lung cancer doesn't mean that it's false that smoking causes lung cancer. Instead, smoking causes lung cancer means smoking causes the incidence of lung cancer to increase in a statistically significant fashion, Ceteris Paribus. Thus, the notion of causation that scientists are using is more complicated than the simple causal notion that we've been examining so far. It is not exceptionless laws that are relevant to the causal claims that most scientists make, but instead statistical laws such that y causes z when y brings about an x% increase in the overall occurrence of z, and again, Ceteris Paribus. This is just what causation means to scientists. So if scientists are using cause in that way, and we still want the causal relationship to be explanatory, then we'll need to make sense of the explanatory relationship that we're calling causal in terms of this particular causal relationship that scientists are using. Well, that's not a problem. So far, so good. We can understand statistical laws. But what exactly do we mean when we say that a law is statistical, as we've been saying? According to one proposal of how to analyze what we're talking about when we employ the concept of statistical laws, the statistical nature of the relevant laws is determined by our level of knowledge or ignorance about the functioning of the laws. The laws do what they do with necessity. The laws themselves aren't statistical. What's statistical is our knowledge of the law. So what probability reflects here is subjective probability, or how much we know about how the laws will function. Now, this proposal seems unacceptable in that it makes laws subjective things, and since almost all of science occurs by interacting with laws in some way, that seems to make science a subjective thing, and that's worrisome if the point of science is to explain, predict, and understand the world as it is on its own. According to another proposal, it's the laws themselves that are statistical. This is better. If we're going to use a conception of statistical, then we should have what's statistical be the world itself. However, if mechanism is true, then laws are deterministic. And what this means is that adding our Ceteris Paribus clause back into the understanding of causation, as it seems we must in order to understand causation as explanatory, removes the statistical nature of the laws again. Once everything is held the same effect happens every time given the same cause. The probability that z will happen given that y happened is always either 1 or 0, since the Ceteris Paribus clause removes whatever factors were responsible for the apparent indeterminacy. So, that is, if mechanism is true of the world, then the laws of nature are deterministic, such that whenever you give the world a cause of a certain sort, it spits out an effect of exactly the same type every time you give it that sort of cause. If we think that laws are statistical in nature, and therefore that our notion of causation that's undergirded by those laws is statistical in nature, that's just because we haven't actually been holding everything fixed. But we have to hold everything fixed in order to make sense of causation as explanatory. So, there are only two ways here to make sense of the statistical nature of causation. One is that by statistical, we really just mean ignorance on our part. We're talking about our own subjective situation. The other is to deny that mechanism is true of the world and to claim that there is genuine indeterminacy in the world. So what about this genuine indeterminacy? According to some interpretations of quantum mechanics, at the foundational level of the quantum world, there are some events that are entirely underdetermined by previous events. This isn't because of our ignorance of those events, but because the mechanistic picture is false, say people who are supporters of these particular interpretations of quantum mechanics. The world, they say, does not function like a deterministic machine. There are some events that even if you knew everything about the laws of nature and all of the previous events, you still wouldn't be able to determine how they would happen. Such indeterminacies are expressed as follows. Here's just an example. The half-life of U-235 is 6.5 times 10 to the 9th years, and that means that for any atom of U-235, the probability that it will have decayed into an atom of lead after 6.5 times 10 to the 9th years is 0.5. This is an actual genuine indeterminacy in the world, and the probability that's expressed here is probability concerning the way the world actually is, and not merely our ignorance of the way the world actually is. Such genuine indeterminacies are probabilistic propensities. The standard way to understand propensities is in terms of the concept of a disposition. Something can have a disposition to have some property or behave in some way, even if it never actually has that property or behaves in some way. So, for example, fragility is a disposition that something has if it will break under certain conditions. And it has this disposition even if it never actually breaks. So, for example, the light bulb that's above my head right now has the disposition that if it were hit, it would break. That's why it's fragile. Now, it's not currently broken. I don't plan on breaking it, but it is currently fragile because it has that disposition. However, probabilistic propensities cannot be made sense of in terms of dispositions. Normal propensities can be made sense of in terms of dispositions, but not probabilistic ones. To see why, notice that the description of disposition requires analysis in terms of counterfactual conditionals. The relevant counterfactual conditional says, if this happened, then this other thing would happen. Like, if the light bulb got dropped, then it would break. That's what gives it the propensity of fragility. But probabilistic propensities aren't undergirded by the sorts of laws that are required to support counterfactual conditionals, because probabilistic propensities aren't undergirded by laws at all. If they were undergirded by laws, then they wouldn't be probabilistic propensities at all. There's nothing that makes a probabilistic propensity the way that it is. It just is that way. This is all well and good if we want to understand the universe in probabilistic terms, and many quantum theorists and those who have accepted these particular interpretations of quantum theory have done this. The problem, however, is that such an understanding rules out the possibility of explaining genuinely indeterministic phenomena in causal terms, since causation is itself a lawful relationship between two events, the cause and the effect. So, if there's genuine indeterminacy in the world, then our prospects for explaining things that are affected by that indeterminacy via causation go out the window. Of course, none of this is to say that causation is not an important part of explanation or that explanation doesn't require causation. What it is to say is that the standard picture of a cause being sufficient for an effect, and that therefore citing the cause allows one to expect the effect, and that this is all there is to explanation, is false. Anyone who wants to tie the notions of scientific explanation and causation to one another needs to make sense of the fact that causes are merely necessary for effects, that ceteris paribus clauses have all sorts of bizarre and difficult implications, that the statistical notion of causation seems either to make explanations subjective or to require genuine indeterminacy, and that genuine indeterminacy seems to rule out the possibility of causal explanation. So what this means is that as philosophers of science, our work is cut out for us. In this lecture, we've looked at 7 topics. 1. Aristotle's 4 causes. 2. Causation, mechanism, and explanation. 3. The fact that causes are merely necessary and not sufficient for their effects. 4. Explanations versus explanation sketches. 5. Ceteris paribus clauses. 6. Causation as statistical explanation. And 7. Indeterminacy. Thank you.